Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Hero Arts blog. I am Natasha of Polite Creations, and today I will be sharing with you a holiday card featuring the holiday foliage stencil. I am also going to be using some nautical cardstock as well as dove cardstock. And from that dove cardstock, I die cut the second largest of the postage nesting dies. And we will have like an oversized stamp that is featured on the card. One of the nautical panels is A2 sized, so that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And the smaller panel is 3 1/4 by 4 1/2. I will begin with the smaller panel. Again, this is 3 1/4 by 4 1/2 inches, and I am going to place my stencil. I reinforce the placement with some mint tape. This is just low tack tape to try to keep everything in place. I will begin by grabbing some hero wax in the color olive, and I am going to use a small blending brush to blend that onto my panel over all of the areas that look like leaves and foliage. Using the smaller blending brushes allows for more control, and you are able to buff the wax into the paper, whereas if you use your fingers, it's a bit messier. I do both depending on what project I am doing with the wax, but for this one, I felt that using a blending brush was the best way to go. I am avoiding all of the little berries that are around on this card panel as well. I will be doing those in a different color. I am using the gold hero wax for the centers of the flowers just to have a bit of pop. I also go in to the branches. I add the wax there as well. And then I go over the inner corners of the leaves just to add a bit of shading and interest to all of the greenery. I wanted to break up some of that color and just play around with this medium as if it were ink. I do take the time in between mediums to wipe off the stencil with a baby wipe just to ensure that it doesn't dry on to my stencil. Also, when using these waxes, try to cover them as much as possible to prevent them from drying out. They do dry fast, especially when you are blending them into the paper. So just imagine how quickly they can dry out if you leave the top off. I do need to go back and add some plastic wrap over the lids just to help these not dry out when they are stored. So that is also a tip for you. Now I am grabbing some unicorn ink and I'm going to go over all of the exposed areas. I do not focus on making it a very dark layer of pigment ink. I'm just placing the ink down. For the berries, this will be a guide for where I will later use lacquer. And for the poinsettias, I am using them as like a base layer. I want the nautical to kind of shine through because I will be using some clear lacquer over these. So I want there to be almost an ombre of color on the poinsettia leaves that are showing. Again, I'm using the clear lacquer pen over the poinsettia leaves. And I started with a thin layer and I did not like how it was filling each little cavity of the stencil. So I do go back and put a big glob in each leaf area. And I'm using a very tiny blending brush just to kind of swirl that in. I will say I do go back and add even more because I want the poinsettia to be thick and lifted. So I basically am putting down a first layer and then I'm going to go back in and fill all of these layers to almost overflow over the stencil just so they have more texture to them. I let things dry a bit and then I grab my silver glitter lacquer pen and I'm going over all of the berries, just putting a glob over those. This adds even more shimmer to the card, and it also allows me time for the clear lacquer to dry on the poinsettia leaves. I will say you should ensure that the wax is dry in between adding the stencil on top, because if you press too hard and the wax is not dry, it will stick to your stencil. So just be very careful. You can heat the wax with your heat tool and just let your paper cool off completely before you manipulate it any further. So here's how it is looking. It may be a little hard to see right now, but there is some shine there. I use my wax and jewel picking tool. I use the non-wax end just to go in and draw some veins on the leaves. I want it to add even more texture. So it just lifts a little bit of that wax off the surface of my paper, and I'm able to add those veins. In an effort to ensure that everything is dry, I use my heat tool to blow some heat onto this card panel, or this smaller panel actually. And I am also dropping it a few times to make sure all of the lacquer settles evenly. As you can see on the full poinsettia there is some dips and like cavities. So I just go over it carefully with the lacquer pen, and this is where I build a thicker layer of that lacquer. Once I am done with this, I heat set it again, and I actually let it bubble. I let all of the lacquer on the poinsettias bubble, and that created so much more texture and made it look even more 3D. So that is another tip for you. Moving on to my A2 panel of that nautical cardstock, I am going to use my stencil again, and I am going to use the Gold Hero wax and buff this design all over the panel, trying to be careful not to smear any of it. But again, I'm using a small little detail brush to do this. You can use your fingers if you choose. You just need to make sure that you don't shift your stencil at all and everything stays in place. Once I am done adding that wax, I heat set it, of course, just to ensure that there's no transfer. And I also use the end of my little jewel picker to kind of scrape off some of the splotches that seeped through. Just do that very, very carefully. You don't want to do it too hard and actually rip your paper. I wasn't too concerned with it because I plan to layer my postage on top. And then I also just go in and fix some of the areas along the edge, since that is mainly what is going to show. I just darken a few of those. Instead of putting the stencil back on, I just use my small little blending brush to add more wax. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my sentiment to the smallest panel, and I am using the color layering holly branch stamp set. This is also a part of the holiday catalog release, and I'm going to use that holly jolly sentiment, and I'm stamping this onto some clear acetate, the clear acetate panels that are available from Hero Arts. Be sure that when you are doing this that you use an adequate amount of anti-static powder all over this, because it really catches all of the embossing powder. So just make sure that you put a good layer of that anti-static powder down before you stamp. And I am using some white detail embossing powder. Once that embossing powder is set, I cut down my sentiment into a strip, and I am making sure that the length of this strip is longer than my smaller little panel. So it should be longer than 3¼ because I will secure this to that panel by folding over the ends and adding adhesive to the back. I try to ensure that the sentiment is not wrapped too tight around the panel so that it doesn't buckle. But once that is complete, it is now time to assemble a card. And I just use the same double-sided adhesive that I used to secure the sentiment to secure this smaller panel to that white postage shape. I find that the double-sided adhesive gives me more security on ensuring that my acetate does not slip off this panel in any way, shape, or form. Once my little postage is complete, I go in with some foam squares and I pop that up onto the A2 card panel that we created. And here is my completed card. So, guys, that is all that I have for you today. Thank you for joining me on the Hero Arts blog as well as a YouTube channel. I am Natasha of Polite Creations. Be sure to subscribe to the Hero Arts YouTube channel as well as my own for more Hero Arts inspiration. Thank you so much for joining me and have a great day.